So where did the coronavirus start and when will we get a decent investigation? The first question is easier to answer than the second. Reports out of China tell us their authorities are still investigating the virus but have not invited international cooperation of any kind or even the World Health Organization to get involved. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has said he's seen evidence the virus might have originated in that Wuhan laboratory rather than a wet market. And our own Prime Minister has dismissed China's claim, echoed by Twiggy Forrest yesterday, that the initial infection might have come from outside China.
We know it started in China. We know it started in Wuhan. The most likely scenario that has been canvassed relates to wildlife wet markets, but that's a matter that would have to be thoroughly assessed. The investigation that needs to take place really does need to understand what happened. Where did it start? What could have been done to, and so we can learn if something similar would happen in any part of the world.
This is frank and straightforward stuff from Scott Morrison. No one wants to inflame tensions between Australia and China, but we have to protect our self-respect and deal in the facts. That's why Morrison has been right to call for an independent international inquiry and right to stick by it after strident and threatening responses from China. And now reports confirm that Australia is supporting Taiwan's bid to be readmitted under observer status at the WHO against China's wishes, of course. Again, that's well done by our national government. The One China policy, which is widely observed, of course, is a bit of a political construct, of course. It doesn't quite reflect the real world. And the real-world challenge of a pandemic demands that an effective country like Taiwan is involved in planning and sharing information and expertise. So Australia is again strongly standing up for common sense. And just to show you how this can be perceived elsewhere, let me first give you a bit of context. Let me show you how American humorist David Sedaris once described Australia in The Spectator USA as Canada in a thong. I guess a sexy or brash version of Canada. That gives you the context for a tweet today from the New York editor of The Spectator USA, Melissa Chen. She noted Australia has pushed for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus, stood its ground despite threats of retaliation from China, and now backs Taiwan's return to the WHO. To paraphrase Sedaris, she says, Australia is just Canada in a thong with balls. Canada with balls. Well said, Melissa Chen. I need say no more. Former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer joins us from South Australia. Thanks for joining us again, Alexander. Australia is showing some big kahunas here in the way it's standing up to China, isn't it?
Well, I think it's common sense that there should be an international investigation into what has happened here, as the Prime Minister and others have been pointing out for 10 days now. 200,000 people have died as a result of coronavirus. Economies have been trashed. Huge increases in unemployment and social hardship have been caused by this. The least China can do is work with the rest of the international community on an investigation to establish how this happened. I mean, if it happened in the wet markets of Wuhan, well, let's understand how that happened. And then the Chinese can take measures to ensure it never happens again. Or if it did leak out of the Institute of Virology, which happens to be in Wuhan, well, you know, China can put in place protocols so that never happens again. But we need to find out what's happened. And nobody is attacking China. We're just saying we want to find out what's happened. And the reaction of the ambassador and the spokesman for the foreign ministry in Beijing is very unhelpful to China. It makes China look weak and defensive and uncooperative with the international community.
Now, the US has spoken out strongly about this in the last 48 hours. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has noticed the way that Australia has been threatened over this. Of course, the Americans support an investigation. What's the best way to get an international consensus on this or some international pressure on China? Is it through the G20 or is it going to go through normal UN channels or the WHO or a bit of everything?
I think the answer is a bit of everything. I would start with the major Western countries. Obviously, the Americans are on side, the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, maybe the South Koreans, to get those. And Japanese and the South Koreans might, take longer to bring to the table given their geography. But working with those major Western countries first and foremost, and then secondly, those major Western countries all working through multilateral institutions like the United Nations Security Council, the World Health Organization, and so on. So what we should be saying to China is, look, we're all in this together. Nobody is going to attack you. We just want to find out what is behind all of this. You are part of the international community. You are part of the world. This isn't about ideology. This is about getting to the heart of what this problem really is that has done us so much damage. So let's all work together. But I think we have to, you can't just depend on the Americans. We have to build on some of the major Europeans, some of our Asian partners, to build an international momentum for this investigation.
What would you say to leading business people like Kerry Stokes and Twiggy Forrest, and there have been others around in the past who obviously want to defend not just their commercial interests but Australia's economic interests, but they seem to do it essentially by parroting the Beijing line?
Well, I would say to them, and I know them, of course, and I, as personalities, I think very well of them, but I would say to them, make sure before you go into a public space you have hired a political advisor, so you know the consequences of what you say, that has been properly thought through. I think in Twiggy Forrest's case, to do what he did at the press conference, the trouble is it's detracted from the reason for the press conference, which was to talk about the purchase of PPE equipment from China and his facilitating of that.
Yeah, it had precisely the opposite effect to whose intent.
Exactly. So, I mean, I would, if he wanted to know, he needs help with politics and public relations. That's what he needs help with. Presumably, he had the press conference in order to promote publicly the good work that he believes he's done working with his friends in China. But he undid it all by not having it thought through properly. So my best advice to people like Kerry Stokes, who's said, had his newspaper in Western Australia print various things about China, I would say to the two of them and to others who wish to go into the public space, get some political advice before you go into the public space to help you think through the consequences of your actions. And by the way, I'd say the same thing to the Chinese ambassador in Canberra. He needs a political advisor. He needs somebody who will tell him what the consequences will be if he is to go out and express bullying and aggressive messages to the Australian government and the Australian people. It's not the way to influence Australians, by the way, being rude to them and being aggressive towards them.
But it's not the way of the Chinese political system to give frank and fearless advice to your superiors. No, well, China is becoming a very major power in the world, and it needs to work with the world, not work against the world. And if it wants to work with the world, it has to try to understand the way the world works, not just understand the way communist China may work, but understand how Australia or Britain or the United States or France or, it could be Nigeria, understand how these countries work. A great ambassador is somebody who not only understands the country he or she is posted to, but is able to exercise influence in that country. The problem with the Chinese ambassador here is he clearly doesn't really understand the culture of the country he's posted to, and he's certainly not exercising any influence at all, behaving as he's behaved. Alexander Downer, thanks for talking to us again.